welcome to North Country Matters. My name is Jenne, and I am a student majoring in Communications and Media here at the Department of Clarkson University. Today we are hosting a conversation about public education funding and the Governor's 2013 budget. Joining us in New York State is New York State Assemblywoman Addie Jenne Russell, who serves the 116th River District in St. Lawrence and Jefferson counties. She will discuss current education funding proposals with Carvill and former Potsdam Board of Education member and Donna Seymour of the St. Lawrence County branch of the American Association of University Women. Take it away, ladies.
Thank you, Jenne. Assemblywoman Russell, thank you so much for being here today to discuss education spending proposals. As we all know, this is one of the toughest jobs that you have in the legislature, particularly since 2008 when the economy fell apart. And I guess you probably never had an easy budget year, have you, since you've been there?
I came in right at the right time.
So it's always difficult. To borrow a phrase that was in play a little earlier this month in a different context, it seems like public schools are falling off the fiscal cliff these days, here, at least here in New York and in many other states. As you know, legally, New York State was sued by the Committee for Fiscal Education, saying that they did not provide an equitable education across the state, and they lost. So that's been another thing that has added to the burden of trying to figure out how to fund education. About 38% of school districts last year did not suffer any particular fiscal harm. This year, there's a lot more districts who are in trouble, and they aren't all just here in the North Country. According to Dr. Rick Timms, who's with the statewide school finance consortium, he says many of the poorer school districts may become either educationally or fiscal insolvent within the next 2 to 4 years if New York State can't figure out how to take charge of their funding. Now, the governor has proposed a 4.4% increase in spending, bringing the school aid up to $21.1 billion, which seems like a lot of money, but really, when you get that spread out over almost 800 school districts, it's not as much as you would think. The plan calls for a fiscal stabilization fund, which is a one-time payment of $203 million to help districts who grapple with fixed costs like pensions. His spending proposals also rely heavily on competitive grants, which are essentially pitting one school district against another to compete for school dollars. And there was no significant mandate relief. So we'd like to discuss these problems with you and see if we can come up with some solutions. We know this isn't just a North Country problem. Potsdam and Canton happen to have been the zip codes that came up first because of the issues that we have with so much of our property being not on the tax rolls.
Correct.
But this is coming in a lot of places. So one of the things people are asking for is mandate relief, and Ann's going to speak about that a little bit.
Okay, Addie. You know, of course, that the governor's established a mandate relief council that traveled around New York State for a year and gathered input from a variety of individuals about what could be done to give meaningful relief to school districts. James Dexter, district superintendent from the Saratoga area, BOCES, said he is glad that the council was created, but he feels the recommendations won't provide significant relief at all. And this is a quote: "I think some of the things put on the table are worthy of discussion, but they're not going to prevent schools from going insolvent. Since schools are reeling from aid cuts, from the gap elimination adjustment, from the 2% tax cap, they were counting on meaningful mandate relief. It has to happen. What can you tell us about plans for additional mandate relief in this legislative session?"
Well, it looks like the mandate relief, I guess, types of legislation are kind of being left up to individual legislators to champion. That was the case a certain amount of last year. I was able to pass a piece of mandate relief with Senator Betty Little that allowed for greater savings for purchases of equipment and supplies and things like that. There is a proposal in the governor's budget to get rid of the requirement for an internal auditor for certain size school districts, which may have an impact on many schools here in the North Country. And he's also proposed a pension smoothing option for distressed municipalities, including school districts. But those details haven't been fully provided, and so we're not really sure, if that's a real possibility at this point until, there's more work done to see if that's something we can fiscally do without undermining the pension system. But, a lot of the issues that are talked about around mandate relief really center on paying staff less. School districts are service providers, so their biggest cost is with their employees. Mm-hmm. It's not like they buy a whole lot of supplies or they're not manufacturing something. So when you talk about mandate relief, it's strategies to figure out how to undermine employment contracts and reduce benefits. And so it's not like there's some magic pile of money somewhere that will become available. We're talking about paying people less. And in the North Country, where the cost of living is so high, I'm not sure, how that will have an impact on our education system if we really are talking about paying teachers less, and that'll be less money in our communities. I think there's other strategies that we ought to focus on a lot more right now in terms of the dialogue of how to keep our schools from going educationally and fiscally insolvent.
Addie, if I could just add to that, one thing that I would say from being on a board for so many years and going back through the 90s as well, in the 90s, health insurance was going up 20% a year for a number of years in a row, and it's only gotten worse in the ensuing decade. What I see has happened is that schools have offered a deal 40 years ago when it was cheap, health insurance was cheap. Now it has skyrocketed. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not exactly feeling that schools want to do something negative to employees. What they're saying is, if this benefit keeps growing at this outrageous rate, we're going to have to cut employees. Mm-hmm. So I don't see it as something negative against teachers or other staff members. Mm-hmm. It's something has grown out of proportion. And so that's the kind of relief I think schools are asking
and
about.
And that is really what the Affordable Care Act at the federal level is getting at. Mm-hmm. Is doing it at the federal level will hopefully make it so we don't have inequities across the nation again, and that we can drive the overall cost of health care and thus health insurance down. And so there has been a solution put in place, but it isn't completely phased in. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of mandate relief, that is coming. It's just a compromise couldn't be made to phase it in any quicker than what it already does. But their health benefits are part of a complicated contractual system. Mm-hmm. And we all know that things are negotiated every year, and that's a product of years of bargaining. And so I'm not as quick to undo something that has developed over time, and I think it's a far better approach for school administration to work with those contracts instead of trying to get the state to completely throw them out.
I have a question about that later.
Okay.
Yeah, that's going to come back. Addie, unfairness in the state aid formula and in the way districts are classified by need is also playing a big part in putting some districts into trouble. For example, Canton is looking at a $2 million budget gap, and that's after the governor's proposals were on the table. Mm-hmm. In Potsdam, Superintendent Brady has said that we're probably looking at a $1.2 million gap. In Watertown, Superintendent Freilich thinks that the 2.7% increase they're going to get down there may only be able to keep them from having to cut any more positions, but it's not going to do anything else for his budget bottom line. And looking down the road in Norwood, Norfolk, they're projecting a $3 million budget cap by the time they build their 2016-2017 budget, which they have to start thinking ahead on. So right. What do you say to districts in this situation, and what can be done for them in this coming school year when they're facing a tight crunch and trying to do some long-range planning?
Well, I think the biggest thing that we need to focus on is equity in school aid funding. Mm-hmm. The school aid formula is broken, and we could spend the whole afternoon talking about it, but the way the schools are funded has been politically manipulated for decades. and it has been manipulated to drive money to districts that are represented by politically powerful people. And I don't think I'm telling anyone anything new. You know, we talk about a formula, and people expect that the formula doesn't have any bias built in and hasn't been, you know, monkeyed with. But the fact of the matter is the formula has been twisted and distorted to further political means. And you know, the folks that are benefiting from this political distortion are represented, are essentially in suburban downstate New York.
Part of the 38% that were harmless last year.
Yes, and I would, you know, I would go out on a limb and say that the vast majority of those districts are located in suburban downstate, or perhaps some suburbs outside of the larger cities in upstate New York. So we find ourselves in a situation where folks in New York City and vast swaths of upstate, northern, western, southern tier, we all find ourselves in the position of being shortchanged because of political deals that have been struck for years and years and years. I am the sponsor of legislation, I have been for the past several years, of legislation that attacks the parts of the school aid funding formula that drive money to school districts that don't need it. Before we enacted last year's budget, every school district was entitled to a 3% increase of the money that they received the year before. So that meant that wealthy school districts, even if they didn't need it, were entitled to an increase. A big part of my legislation says you're not entitled to an increase, and works to start to take that ill-gotten funding back over a series of years. We don't do it all at once, but to say you're not entitled to this, you weren't entitled to it, and we're going to undergo a process of bringing that money back into the school aid formula and distributing it to the needy counties or the needy communities that that deserve that funding. So there's a lot of other elements to my bill, but you know, the way that we calculate the average cost to educate a student, the state essentially does not look at the upper echelon of schools that are spending the most. And my bill says you look at all of the successful school districts and you throw out the bottom 10% that spend the least, and you throw out the top 10% that spend the most, instead of rigging the average to focus on the poorest end of the scale, which is what it does. So it depresses that number that is plugged into the school aid formula.
And then you go back to the point that the Fiscal Equity Committee made, was that it's completely broken because you've got very poor districts who cannot afford to educate children in the same way that you can in these suburban districts.
And with the cuts over the last couple of years, it's actually penalized fiscally responsible school districts that didn't have bloated fund balances and that were operating very lean. And we have found ourselves in the North Country. We have a lot of fiscally responsible school districts, and we're the ones feeling the pinch the quickest.
Right.
Okay, Addie, the next question is about the one-time $203 million fiscal stabilization fund. It's certainly gotten mixed reviews since the public's heard about it. Some claim it's an accounting gimmick that won't benefit the pension system in the long term or the taxpayers. One of our local superintendents, Stephen Putnam, has said, "I think it's really risky and a tenuous proposition, and I think there's some serious doubts as to whether it's constitutional. Others say it's a way to steal money from the future to meet current needs." So, having said that, what I ask of you is, if it comes into being, do you know how these funds will be distributed? Do you know also what possible risks schools are entering into if they lock into a fixed rate for 25 years and then the rate drops down in the near future? And finally, my question, of course, is it constitutional?
So I actually am not sure that we're talking about two different issues. Okay. You've mentioned a $203 million pool of money, but I'm not sure if that, and then you're also talking about pension smoothing, and I think those might be two separate discussions.
Okay, well,
so I'm not, so I mean, that's part of the problem, is that we don't have a tremendous amount of detail as to whether this $203 million is an additional pot of money that districts can once again compete for or have to demonstrate need, and if so, what type of formula is going to be used to demonstrate that type of need to access that pot of money. And then, you know, then the governor has also proposed kind of locking in at a rate to contribute to the pension system for a longer period of time, instead of being allowed to, you know, decrease at some point in the future when contributions to the retirement system don't need to be as high in order to sustain it, you know, its solvency as well. So we kind of we may be looking at two different issues, but I guess the fact of the matter is we haven't been provided details on either pension smoothing proposals or on this $203 million pot of money.
Yeah.
And if that's just a one-time to help ailing school districts, you know, until, you know, in lieu of essentially districts turning the keys over to the state, you know, but really we don't have, the governor has not provided those details, and that's what we will work to flesh out over the next couple of weeks in the legislature, is just how you know, these monies are to be distributed and under what type of system.
Hey, and Addie, have you heard any arguments about the constitutionality of it with regards to the prohibition on the impairment of retirement benefits? Have the politicians been talking about that at all?
Can you give me a little bit, I guess, more context of what particular issue you're talking about?
Well,
the impairment of retirement benefits. I'm not sure that's.
Well, what I seem to be reading in the newspaper accounts of this is they're talking about efforts to stabilize insurance, pension costs, and whether the efforts that are being recommended in any way fall into a non-constitutional level.
I guess I'm not familiar with those arguments that are being put forth. I think a lot of the discussion centers around whether it's whether it will undermine the solvency of the system, which then would be a problem. Right. And I think, you know, I think that's probably in the context of the arguments at this point, is that, you know, we can't do something to undermine an obligation that the state has entered into. But I'm not, I guess, familiar with some of the other components that people might be talking about at this point.
I think it'll surface as the days pass.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's always a legal pursuit in those kinds of things.
Yes, I don't think people are trying to change. I don't think the proposal is aimed at reducing benefits that employees are currently entitled to. I think it is a system of, that the governor is proposing, at least how he's presented it, of being able to pay lesser rates now with the expectation that even in the future when rates go down, you will continue to pay higher rates. So it's kind of like a fixed mortgage rate instead of a variable mortgage rate.
But it's still a lot of money, one way or the other.
It's a lot of money.
One of the conundrums that we find ourselves in is the catch-22 of the state requiring more and more of districts in terms of proving that they're doing a good job of educating, at the same time that you're seeing schools forced to slash programs, cut teachers, and deplete reserves because of financial considerations. There's an article in one of the Central New York newspapers just this week. Ilion and Mohawk districts are considering merging, and so they've been going through that discussion. And for one Mohawk senior, she doesn't really care about that. She's just worried about the fact that she has 3 study halls instead of 3 courses that she could be taking, because in her school district so many positions have been cut and so many classes aren't being offered. Locally, Potsdam has cut 15% of their staff. Canton has lost 20% of faculty and staff in the last couple of years. How do we resolve that problem? How do we insist that schools give us better educational outcomes when we have a climate where teachers and programs are being slashed by fiscal necessity? How do we address that issue in this next couple of years while we're trying to figure out how to maybe restructure schools in a way that would let them run a little more inexpensively?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be focused, extremely focused on the school aid issue. That has to be our prime concern. The cuts called the gap elimination adjustment are really what is hampering our school districts the most right now. And then moving forward, when additional funding is put on the table, we need to have the formula scrubbed, cleaned up, and get rid of these political manipulations, so that we actually are distributing aid in a fair way. But beyond that, school districts and communities are going to have to look at their long-term sustainability, and it's more than just financial sustainability. It is what they're able to provide for programming for their students. There's a lot of discussion right now about regional high schools, and there's a tremendous amount of confusion about whether or not you can create a regional high school under the laws right now. You absolutely can create a system where some of a school district's student body goes to another school, and you can take care of that through contracts.
Okay.
So you don't need, it goes on all over the state right now. There are essentially regional high schools without the need for any new legislation to empower school districts. I've sat in on a number of community discussions that have involved several school districts in different regions of St. Lawrence County. And that is, one thing that people are being confused about. What are they allowed to do under law? Well, you can do a lot under existing law. You don't have to wait for the state to take action. It's time for our communities to go through that process of determining what they want their school district to look like in the future. But I would also suggest that you might be able to do a partial regional school or regional high school. You can phase in, how much you regionalize, and it's not permanent.
Right.
So you can do something on a temporary basis. You can try it out. You can use the good old-fashioned trial and error to see if it's something that you really want to do or continue to look at.
Lisbon Central is looking into virtual mergers. That's one of the things they've just begun to explore by using some of the distance learning features that BOCES makes available. A follow-up question, the governor has put $75 million into a proposal for pre-K and is also at the same time asking for a longer school year as one of his goals. Do you think that that's a realistic approach, given the constraints that schools are under right now, to throw another program at them, and with the idea that the funding could be pulled out from underneath them in another year to go to all the trouble of developing a full-day pre-K?
Well, I support pre-K programs 100%. They are fantastic. My son is in pre-K. I anticipate my daughter will be in pre-K. But just like any other component of education in this state, pre-K programs are not funded. They are actually a cost to just about every school district that runs them. And I have several school districts in the 116th district that cannot afford to even to provide the existing pre-K program. I really think we need to do more to ensure that every district can have a pre-K program before we start talking about enhancing the pre-K program. I think it's a misunderstanding on the part of some that school districts do not offer pre-K universally, and that is something I think we should address before we start tinkering with the system. But that we have to understand that these are not solutions, and these are not going to provide the extra funding that school districts need. They are going to maybe help buffer the loss in school aid and the diminished educational programs at the higher end of the school grades. But I think we need to really ensure that all school districts have it. And
have at least a program.
And it's not even, and most programs aren't even large enough to serve the population that would like to be in pre-K. And then, moving from a 2.5 hour day to a 5 hour day is also out of the reach of so many people because they can't afford to leave work because there isn't transportation to and from pre-K in many areas. And that extra expense really ought to be taken into consideration as well.
Yes, I agree.
So the transportation cost, the logistics of a family being able to take advantage of a pre-K program, also leaves those that are the neediest out of these wonderful programs.
Yeah.
Okay. Addie, what I'd like to talk about now is the local role in some of the problems that are facing school districts fiscally. School superintendents and boards of education, as you mentioned before, they've approved contracts and they've signed them, they've ratified them. And what has been discovered over the period of decades is that some of the benefits that were guaranteed are unsustainable. In Potsdam Central, for instance, benefits will cost more than salaries in 4 years. 9.9 million proposed for salaries and 10 million on benefits. So we can see that local school districts have had a role in getting us to where we are. However, in all fairness to them, they couldn't have predicted what would happen to some of these expenses. And secondarily, they are dealing with obstacles with regards to laws that make negotiations favor one side of the table. So many superintendents feel that they're negotiating with their hands tied behind their back. My question to you, Addie, what can superintendents and boards of education do to limit these runaway costs of health insurance and other guaranteed benefits, and what, if anything, can the New York State Legislature do to help out?
Well, we are looking at options specifically related to these issues. The governor has put forth the pension smoothing option. The governor has also put money in the budget, you know, that we don't have the details on, but he says to specifically address healthcare and pension costs. So it's not an issue that is falling on deaf ears. We absolutely understand that. But the provisions of law that we're talking about really only come into effect when school districts, the administration, and the employees cannot come to an understanding. Right. And the best solution is to have an open and honest line of communication, and so that everyone understands the situation that they're in. You know, I would argue that given the fiscal climate right now, both sides are both being, you know, kind of on the losing end of things. And so there are no winners, right. and I think that it's best for us to work in a cooperative manner instead of trying to be hostile toward each other, because we all have to be part of the solution, and the state understands that we have to be part of the solution as well.
Okay, thank
well,
you,
as usual, we are just about out of time, and we still have things on our list. But what can the public do to help move this process forward as the negotiations for the budget go on in the legislature? What do you need the public to do in terms of helping you do your job?
It's very helpful to receive a lot of communication, not only to us legislators, but also to the governor's office. So really it's about telling our story, and I'm working to tell our story in Albany, but as many voices as can be, you know, marshaled and brought together, the louder our story is heard. You know, there have been community groups across the North Country that have been making calls and writing letters, and I know that it's being noticed. Whether or not, you know, what we're asking for has been included in the budget, our voices are being heard, and we have to continue to have them heard throughout this budget process. And I just want people to understand that the time for advocacy is now, and when the budget is passed by April 1st, this issue will be done for the year. And so now is the time, and we really need people, if you can travel to Albany and talk to legislators and on this issue, now is the time to do that. But if not, emails and letters and telephone calls you know, are what is needed at this time to really share our story and explain what we're going through and provide the solutions.
Addie?
Your legislation,
Yes.
To fix the school aid formula, will that be tackled before the budget or after the budget?
I'm sorry, I have to cut it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's unfortunately the end of our show today. These WCKN conversations are a production of North Country Matters, produced in the studios of WCKN on the campus of Clarkson University. This show is a civic collaboration between the St. Lawrence County branch of the American Association of University Women, the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters, and the mass media and communication students here at Clarkson University. Thank you.